2022, a conference was held in Davos, Greenpeace, with one of the main objectives of addressing the climate crises. Participants called for bold collective action on climate change. They decried that a decline in climate leads to environmental degradation, food insecurity, and that we must reach net zero emissions. And then the conference was over, and all the participants went home on their private jets. Truly, do as I say, not as I fly. But while this may seem like a brief instance of hypocrisy, instances like this aren't rare. There's a growing trend of the biggest climate change offenders taking a virtuous stance and telling the rest of the world that we must do more in order to address impending doom. Take, for example, multinational oil corporation Shell, who on November 2nd, 2020 took to their Twitter to ask followers, what are you willing to change to help reduce emissions? Because clearly the large brunt of emissions is on Twitter user @PixieDust2547, or Bill Gates, who announced that he was searching for a climate-saving farm. Will aboard his 354-foot super yacht. Think about that the next time you ask for a paper straw at Starbucks. But instances like this aren't even just relegated to the climate. From racial relations in America to critiques on class, we are obsessed with speaking out on issues for the sake of image rather than to actually put in place change. And as journalist Dan Pelosa asks, if we continue to fight for change for the trend, what happens when the trend dies? So to address this, first we'll talk about how our obsession with image is tied within our advocacy. And then we will determine some solutions to make our activism much less performative. Now, climate change activists aren't the only ones guilty of speaking out for the sake of public image. Summer of 2020, protesters took to the streets to protest the killing of a black man by law enforcement. In response, my suburban friends took to their Instagrams to post black squares captioned with Black Lives Matter, #StandAgainstInjustice. Celebrities weren't immune to this either. Pop star Justin Bieber took to his own Instagram on September 21st, 2020, to post a link to sweatshirts with "Racism is evil" in fuzzy white letters. Very brave, Justin. Truly the MLK of our time. However, merely 4 years later, this movement remains seemingly a relic of the past. 4 years later, public outcry has all but dissipated. 4 years later, the Marshall Project reports that reforms have been slow. There's been limited reforms on police legislation, Congress has failed to pass comprehensive reforms, and elements of the Biden administration's policing executive order remain long overdue. In the eyes of the general public, the Black Lives Matter movement came and went almost faster than a TikTok trend. However, the Black Lives Matter movement is not alone. Martin Luther King, in his renowned Letter from a Birmingham Jail, reminded us of this phenomenon as far back as the 60s, when he criticized white moderate clergymen for publicly claiming they wanted racial justice without taking the steps to fight for that justice. However, as journalist Maddie Pansami explains, social media has led to a rise in this trend, the picking up of a social issue for the sake of social approval more prevalent than ever. This is performative activism. Performative activism looks like attending a climate strike march, but not addressing your own carbon footprint. Performative activism looks like posting a black square for Blackout Tuesday, but not taking any further anti-racist actions. And performative activism looks like posting a rainbow for Pride Month, but staying silent when it comes to advocating for legislation that will help LGBTQ+ people. And I fear, if we continue to see activism as a performance, we risk performing for praise instead of progress. Now, a similar example of this can be seen on a global scale. As a Kenyan immigrant, I've gotten to see both sides of the causes and effects of short-term mission trips. I've participated in NGOs who have the sole purpose of helping developing countries, and I've had my very own Kenyan mother tell me that oftentimes developing countries can be hurt if this type of volunteer work is not done properly. Nigerian writer Teju Cole coins this as the white savior industrial complex. a phenomenon in which Western volunteers of any race enter a developing country, perform a week's worth of volunteer work before returning to their country of origin. Cole claims that the white savior industrial complex is not about justice. It's about having a large emotional experience that validates privilege and allows us in the imperial core to appear as charitable without putting in place systemic solutions. And as the Trinitonian reported in 2022, oftentimes many short-term missionaries don't have the proper skill set for the construction of building, the administering of medicine, or the administering of education, leading to the decreased efficacy of these trips. However, Black and brown children continue to be used as props for Instagram photo ops. The problem with performative activism is that it allows us to hide behind the guise of being a part of the solution. Performative activism breeds complacency. In the wake of a tragedy, Texas State Representative James Tallarico's words offered a haunting truth. Just 18 days after a mass shooting took lives in Lewiston, Maine, Tallarico boldly declared, "We cannot offer thoughts and prayers on Monday and then debate legislation to loosen gun restrictions on Tuesday." As a religious man himself, Tallarico clarified that he himself believed in the profound power of prayer. However, he stated that there is something profoundly cynical about telling constituents we're going to ask God to solve a problem that we are not willing to solve ourselves. A similar disconnect extends to climate change activism. ActionAid reports that over 1 million people currently live on degrading agricultural land. And the most of these people are in the poorest of countries. The United Nations just published a scathing indictment of global leadership on climate change. However, climate change billionaires, who contribute the most to emissions, continue to ride around in their $1,000,000 planes. And in the case of police reform, the Washington Post reported that in the year following George Floyd's death, 1,048 people were shot and killed by police officers. That was more than 1,020 in 2020, more than 999 in 2019, and the most since the Washington Post has ever reported since they began in 2015. How much longer do marginalized communities need to be used as talking points for them to see actual, tangible change? Now, what is the solution to this issue? Because it's not to stop speaking out. The only thing worse than complacency is complete apathy. However, I believe that we have the tools in our everyday lives to start addressing this issue. And in order to do so, I decided to interview some people that were close to me. And 3 answers stood out. First, by one of my close friends, McKenna. And McKenna told me that she believed when she was opening the door for someone, she noticed to herself, or she was thinking to herself, was she doing this because she felt like it was the right thing to do, or because she wanted to be perceived as a good person? Now, my first thought when she said this was, maybe you're overthinking this a little. But my second thought was, McKenna was showing a valuable character trait: introspection. The American Journal of Psychiatry tells us that social media is constantly giving us a barrage of social movements, leading us to giving no one movement the due diligence it deserves. So I implore you to take the time and actually find out what you are passionate about and what you want to make a change in, not just what you want to be seen doing because you want to be seen as a good person. Now, the next person I interviewed was Miss Baker. Miss Baker is one of my family friends, and she taught me that in order to become an effective advocate, you have to get involved in the community that you're trying to help. As someone who has extensive experience in getting involved in the community, she told me the key thing to this is listening to others. Telleria Lavery and her TED Talk, Your True Journey to Activism, teaches us that being an activist takes deep, uncomfortable conversations with people who are directly impacted by an issue. So making sure that you're getting close and asking those difficult questions, having those hard conversations, is imperative to seeing social change. And finally, I talked to my AP government teacher, Mr. H. And he told me that oftentimes people don't have hours in their day to dedicate to becoming activists. And that's okay. However, it's important that we reach out to our elected officials, whether this is by petitioning, directly talking to offices, or simply just voting. Getting involved in your political system is a great way to be an advocate for those who need it the most. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of the protests that are currently going on college campuses. I recently just graduated high school this year, and my college next year, Columbia University, has been in the news a lot for protests. And one thing that I hope to see in the future is that these protests, peaceful protests, don't die down when an issue gets out of the news cycle. It's imperative that we break the cycle of performative activism starting today. Karundi Williams, the CEO of an organization that's dedicated to pushing for diversity in political circles, states that we can say that things are changing because the national dialogue is changing, but until we get to the crux of an issue, until we get to the root of it and dismantle the systems that allow injustice to exist in the first place, things will stay the same. Although Ms. Williams was specifically referencing the Black Lives Matter movement, many other movements can benefit from these sentiments. In a world obsessed with Band-Aid solutions, make your activism that much less performative. Thank you.